So XR at Work is back. We said we'd be here, didn't we, Dane?
We did.
And here we are.
And here we
So
are.
we're doing a series. In case you haven't seen the first episode, episode 1 was published last week on June 13th. Here we are on June 20th, releasing our second episode about the return on investment for implementing extended reality in industrial environments. So we call this XR ROI.
We
Well,
needed
like
more acronyms.
alphabet salad there, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
So we talked last week about the use of XR in factory environments and how you can keep machines running longer. You can reduce your downtimes. You can save on lost time and materials by training in factories if you want to use VR out in a training room. So we went through a couple of use cases there, and we really encourage you to go back and look at episode 1 on YouTube or listen to it in Spotify. But today we're going to talk about the ROI of extended reality as it applies to, we call it EHS, Enterprise Health and Safety, or just the phrase I use a lot is just safety, right? So because safety does mean good health, right, Dane?
That's right. Yeah. So, for us, environmental health and safety for any business should be at the forefront of what people are thinking about. It's kind of your right to operate your business, right? So there's a lot of applications in environmental health and safety for how do we more effectively train people? Because a lot of times the things that we're training people on for EHS applications are the dangerous, things. It's, be careful of this, make sure you're cautious here, et cetera. And so I think we'll talk through a couple different use cases today and some examples. But one thing I wanted to call out in the beginning is that the nice thing about environmental health and safety is that every manufacturing business has to adhere to some form of environmental health and safety standard. And the nice thing too is those standards are generally OSHA standards. And so there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration with other businesses in this space because everybody wants to keep their people safe. And we all adhere to the same standards. So wanted to give an example of an application that we would use, but there's tons of different applications that can be shared. And also there's some marketplaces that are starting to pop up, particularly in the VR space, where you can actually just buy OSHA related content off the shelf. And so, for somebody who's getting started in the space, environmental health and safety is a good place to start because you don't have to try and build custom one-off trainings. You can just buy something from an app store. So the example that I'm going to be walking through today is talking about we're going to be talking about environmental health and safety, but I'm going to talk about fire extinguisher training in particular. So fire extinguisher training is obviously something that everybody that works in a manufacturing facility has to go through. And what we found is that in a traditional way of training for fire extinguisher training, the environmental health and safety manager for a site generally will set up 3 or 4 different times where everybody can come in. Usually it's like a PowerPoint. In some cases, everybody stands around like a propane fire and actually discharges a fire extinguisher. And so, the traditional method's tough because it requires a bunch of people to coalesce in the same place at the same time. And in a busy manufacturing site, that's difficult to get people away from their day job. So one of the things that we did that was really effective is we built a fire extinguisher training, and it allows you to do the PASS method, right? So it's kind of the traditional training acronym or whatever for doing fire extinguisher training. And the cool thing about it, though, is we actually integrated it into like the LMS system that we use. And so, if I'm an operator that was working on second shift or night shift, and traditionally, I might have had several days on during the night. And traditionally, I would have to make time to come in during the day for me to go and do that training. Whereas the cool thing with VR is you throw on a headset and it could be 2:00 in the morning. You can go through your fire extinguisher training. It immediately signs you off in the LMS system. So there's no kind of manual intervention that's required there. And you can go about your day. And then on top of that, the with like the traditional fire extinguisher training, it's like up to the person who's leading it to stand there and take notes. And so, there's no way to know, like, did they pick the correct place to tackle the fire from based on the wind direction, for instance, right? Whereas with VR, you can have markers that show you, hey, the wind's blowing this way. Pick the location that you're going to be tackling the fire from, and so there's a lot more decisions that you can force the user to go through to really get an understanding of how they're performing. And so I think there's tons of opportunities. Like you have elevated heights and line break training and confined space, and all these different places where all of us follow the same rules and regulations. And so being able to train people, one, in something that's convenient to them, so they don't have to come into the site, for or whatever. You're also not spending the money to actually replace the fire extinguishers that you evacuate, during the training. And then the other nice thing is that you have the opportunity to go through it over and over again. You don't have to worry about anybody actually getting burned. So there's lots of benefits there. And so, generally what we've found is that just the savings on not actually spraying fire extinguishers is enough to justify the cost of the training overall. And people have a better experience. In fact, I have a funny story. I think I've maybe told this before, but when we first implemented our training, people would intentionally fail the fire extinguisher training because they wanted to go through it again because they were having fun in VR. And I made a joke to our EHS manager that I bet you never thought that people would want to go through fire extinguisher training so bad that they would intentionally fail it, the first time.
Right.
And so the gamification piece of that really makes sure that people are engaged, makes sure that they are, learning. And then also it's a more fun, method for doing that. So that's my rant on fire extinguisher training, Scott.
No, that's cool. So I'm hearing a few things, right? So we talk about ROI, right? I mean, obviously this costs something, but your first point was that the costs are coming down.
Mm-hmm.
These sorts of marketplaces, the cost of these apps and this content is getting cheaper all the time. I'm seeing the same thing, right? It used to be you had to go create this yourself, $100,000 in labor to go create an app, and now for $25 a month you can go get it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, the cool thing too, I think PTC did a report on this, and I'll have to go back and see if I can find it. But they talked about the cost of VR training, and they said really VR works really well when you're at scale, right? Because like the cost, if you do like per capita, it's more expensive. But as you kind of spread that across more people in the organization, it becomes cheaper and cheaper.
Right.
And so something like fire extinguisher training, where everybody has to do it, that's at a facility, at least like ours, it makes it way more cost effective than if you start with like a niche use case where you have to kind of make the bet that it's going to return on value.
That makes sense. So what I'm hearing is that you get to, like, maybe to your point, Dane, you're spreading out the training. It's not everybody show up off shift and do this, which is labor intensive and inconvenient. You're not spraying actual fire extinguisher stuff. You're not worried. You don't have live fires, so it's safer. There's less labor, less time to re-enter stuff into LMS, because in VR we can tie that to the LMS. I know you tie into your LMS. I tie into mine in our day jobs, and it's a big time saver there. It just streamlines things. It's like there's some hard savings with cost of replacing charges in your fire extinguishers. But I think it's interesting too. You and I talked about this on episode 1, is that everything's not super quantifiable. Everything's not where you can just go, oh, this saved us X amount of money. Sometimes it's just that it's really cool. It's a culture thing. It's an employee morale or engagement thing, and just people just find it better than watching that dang 7-minute video that they've watched every year for the last 12 years on how to put out a fire. This actually is more interesting, and it's tough to quantify that, right, Dane? But it's helping with your retention.
Yeah. Well, and the other cool thing is, for those of you guys that are getting started and you might be thinking about like an EHS application as like your first app. The nice thing is if everybody has to use it, then the next time that you have a new piece of content, they have already been in a headset. They've already tried it. They're fairly comfortable with the concept of it. And so not only is it like it's an application that has a positive ROI, but it's like the Trojan horse, that gets you the VR headsets onto people,
Yeah.
and allows them to experiment and get to know, the technology itself too.
How much of a VR, just a quick digression, how much of a VR are you finding that? Because I see some of this, but I mean, I'm curious of your thoughts, Dane. How much are you seeing where if you can just kind of break through that and kind of demystify what it's like in VR, that's a big thing to just kind of break through. And then it starts to be easier to do subsequent trainings in virtual reality once you get through that first time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, I've run into this several times too, where like, I'll send videos to people, and like we'll try and explain it as best we can
Yeah.
by conversation, and it's not until they put the headset on that they go, "Oh my god, like I get it now," right? So,
Right.
um, any excuse that I can get to put somebody in a device, I think is helpful to me, because generally I don't run into any problems once somebody has a headset on. It's everything before that, that you have to contend with,
Yeah.
at least
Yeah.
in my experience.
Right. So I think we're seeing kind of the same sort of thing, right? Is that so? It's certainly the case where content's getting cheaper. Makes a lot of sense from an ROI perspective, just on the money side, just from moving things from actual live
Hmm.
trainings and demonstrations into virtual reality, because that content, yeah, it may cost a lot to train the first person, but over time, over scale,
Yep.
it's less and less involved.
Well, the other thing, and I think we talked about this last time, but the consistency of training across
Mm,
everyone is a big thing as well, right? So you're
yeah,
not worried about like, oh, well, this person gives this version of the presentation, and this other person, gives a different,
yeah,
version of that or whatever. Like, everybody goes through the exact same experience, and is able to, benefit from it in the exact same way. So yeah.
your prowess at this activity, how good you are at it, is not dependent on what mood your trainer was in that day and how
Yep.
thorough or not they went through it, right? You get
Yep.
to learn the right way to do it every time because it's immortalized in virtual reality.
Exactly. Well, and sometimes, you could argue that people aren't even really very good at, I mean, everybody has different perspectives on what good looks like. And so if you
Yeah,
can get your SMEs to agree on this is what good looks like, it makes everybody's life easier.
right, right.
So I know you have some cool use cases in the EHS space too. So I'm interested. I know some of your stuff's more like on ergonomics, right?
Yeah, I mean, ergonomics is a big thing for us, right? And so I'll be careful not to give away anything, tied to my employer, but I will tell you that uh, in manufacturing in general, right, and in a lot of in these industrial environments, ergonomics is a big thing. And so for in my experience, what I've seen for us is that um, we you may I'll term it this way: you may see in your factories that um, people get soft muscle tears, sprains, strains, uh, stress on soft tissue things, right? From repetitive motion, lifting things overhead, heavy things at weird angles, tables or conveyor belts being at weird heights, and so repetitive motion. The first 20 minutes is not tough, but 7 months into it, right? I mean, you're really, you're
Absolutely.
straining those muscles. So, if you're seeing that, like some factories see that this is an issue, I've seen success in and taking a look at it from the perspective of we talk about that ROI, Dane. Take a look at it from the perspective of uh, someone getting hurt in a factory, in a warehouse, in an oil and gas environment, on the oil field. It's not just lost it is lost time, so lost labor, right? So you lose that person um,
Mm,
at work and you have to have a replacement. Maybe you don't get as much throughput because now you're down a person or two, right? um, it's bad on the equipment, right? So you're going to tear up equipment. You've got people when they're not performing at peak, or when they get physically injured, there tends to be a lot of times some sort of mechanical or equipment damage as well. But one of the things that we looked at too, Dane, is that when you look at people getting injured on the job, right? No one's going to tell you exact numbers, but there's a workman's comp claim number tied to that for every company. Any
Mhm.
company you talk to, if they're honest with you, somebody's going to tell you, oh, yeah, we had X million dollars in workman's comp claims last year due to safety issues
Mhm.
or life changing events. I
Right.
don't know. What do you guys call these in your company? We call them LCEs.
Yeah, we do too.
LCEs. So life changing events, which could be, life changing like this kind of life changing or life changing like, you know, worse, right? But life changing events, or maybe it's just a strain or a sprain. I've had a back issue the last couple of weeks myself. Because this new rowing machine that I'm super proud of, man, I wasn't doing it right and I hurt my back. But muscle strains and stuff, it can be an LCE. It causes me to have to go to the doctor. I'm out of work. I'm not performing at my best. And maybe I even do a workman's comp claim if this happened, on the job. So
Mhm.
when you think about ergonomics, think about soft muscle strains, think about workman's comp claims tied to that. There's a use case where um, athletic trainers that work in a lot of facilities. You guys have athletic trainers maybe in your company?
No, we don't, but I'm super interested to hear.
We do. We have so you think about people who are doing a physical job all day, every day, right? We have trainers, much like an athlete would use, to help them with stretching, with injury prevention, with kind of triage and recovery from ergonomic issues, from soft tissue stuff. Well, those athletic trainers may not need to be in a factory for 40 hours a week, waiting for 3 weeks from now in the afternoon when somebody comes in with a sore shoulder.
Mhm.
It's just not cost feasible. So what I've seen is you take an athletic trainer and have them do kind of office hours through Teams or Zoom or some sort of video conferencing to do kind of triage, so someone can walk into a private room in the factory and walk up and get into a session on video and say, hey, I'm having this issue. I was doing this, and the trainer's like talking, here, let me see what's your, what caused this. And so this helps with getting them on a recovery plan
Mm.
for nursing that back to health. It also helps with being able to assess. Have an athletic trainer, like we use one that does office hours for multiple factories, but he knows that at this one factory that he has office hours with every Tuesday afternoon, for example, Dane. Um, this guy had a little bit of a strain, right? Take some ibuprofen, right, and take the rest of the day off. And then the next day he shows up in a neck brace, or he doesn't show up. His attorney contacts you and is
Oh
like,
wow, yeah,
"Yeah, he's laid up and he's suing for $1 million." It's like, wait a minute.
yeah,
Yesterday it was just a little shoulder thing
yeah.
when we did the triage call with the trainer. So it's good for the employees. It's good for the company. It's good for your insurance, right? Because it works to reduce workman's comp claims by catching and documenting kind of what's going on there. But here's another thing that happens, right? Through this same technology, as an athletic trainer, I can say I can do these triage calls with people in the plant and see their range of motion and stuff. But I can also say, hey, trainer in the factory, I want you to put that HoloLens on, or I want you to carry that tablet, and every 2 weeks, I want you to get into a Teams call or into a Dynamics Remote Assist call or whatever sort of remote expert call you guys are using, and I want you to walk the floor, and I want to watch and see what's going on the plant floor. Oh, hey, hang on a second. Walk back here, point your camera at that. Yeah, that we need to do something about that. That's not right. That's going to cause injuries. So
Hmm.
now you start to take that remote expert technology that we've talked about and you enable an expert to be able to do a virtual walkthrough of a plant and identify and address ergonomic issues before they become a bigger problem.
That's
So
really
that's how we take that technology and we use athletic trainers to triage and prevent, hopefully, soft muscle, soft tissue
That's
injuries.
awesome. We have a similar, it's like a VR training, but it's
Yeah.
about like JHAs, right? So you actually have somebody go and walk through an area that has potential hazards, and they have to like point out the hazards as they're going through. And so it's
Yeah.
not like, you're not relying on, following Jim Bob around out in the field and having him point stuff out to you.
Right.
A lot of the times in EHS, the challenge is that you have to kind of see it happen first, right? Like a lot of EHS is experiential. It's like, oh, last time that happened, it was
Mm-hmm.
because of this, or whatever. And so the cool thing about it is you can kind of institutionalize a lot of that information and pass that on to people without having to have them follow somebody seeing you around for a long time and hear all the stories and all that stuff. So,
but you're right there. I mean, when you think about on the ROI topic, right? When I talk about this athletic trainer stuff, and of course it costs a little bit of money for an athletic trainer, but the technology there, and then the technology that's used for remote expert, I mean, this is cheap stuff, right? The technology side of it is relatively inexpensive. And if it reduces your LCE rate this month or this year, it's good for the company. It's going to provide cost savings and benefits to the company through less lost wages, right? And lost time on the floor, and potentially less workman's comp claims. And so this is just not expensive stuff. Arguably, the cost of that athletic trainer, and in your case, the cost of the device and the device and maybe some software, it's just not expensive. It's tough maybe to quantify. How does this training save us money this week? Maybe not, but over time it's the right thing to do, and it's going to have a positive impact on your payouts through injuries.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say I think that's traditionally hard in EHS applications too is that it has a long tail on it. Right. So it's not like you just like start it up and then immediately, all your incident rates drop to zero.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like, it has to cascade through the organization too. And so that's one thing that for anybody who's looking at doing this type of use case, if your metrics are tied to organizational or like culture change within the business, make sure that you're upfront with leadership about like, hey, this is something that like we'll see a change over time, but it's not a on-off switch that you just flip on and all of a sudden everything's fixed kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because
we talked about lockout tagout stuff last week in episode 1 of this series. Arguably, lotto training and lotto support, factory workers, there's absolutely EHS ramifications tied to that.
Absolutely. Well, and it's expensive too if you mess that up, because you can, like, when we talk about messing up equipment, it's like, okay, not only are you paying for the cost of, destroying a pump or, whatever it is that happened, you're also paying the cost of the efficiency loss from not having the plant running during that time. And so, like a day's worth of downtime caused by not even including the fact that somebody could have really gotten hurt because it's lockout, tagout, and it's energy isolation. Like not even including that, which is enough, in and of itself to justify it. Beyond that, it's like, you might lose a whole day's worth of production, which depending on, the business and stuff, that's going to be a different dollar amount, but it should be a lot of money, right? And it should be enough for us to care about. And so, lockout, tagout, like I think lockout, tagout's like one of the main ways that people end up, like with fatalities and stuff in manufacturing, is because they don't effectively lock out the equipment that they're working on. And then, you have all kinds of issues that come from that. So I don't know about you, Scott, but like we use AR a lot for like lockout, tagout type stuff where it's, hey, let's make sure that person is flipping the correct switch or turning the right valve or, working with, the correct equipment, because you can actually verify it by having it look at the space that you're working in, and it gives better the directions than like looking at a printout in a binder,
Sure.
trying to guess. Like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, Scott, but there was one time I was looking at a procedure, and it's a picture, and like it's a good picture of the thing that you're supposed to be looking at, but there's nothing around it. And so you just see the picture of like a valve or something like that, and it's like, we got a million valves around here. Like, how do
Yeah.
I know that I'm on the right one?
Right.
And so I think that verification piece is really important, particularly like you said in the lockout tagout space.
I think it's good stuff to talk about, Dane. I mean, I'm glad we're doing this series, and I'm glad we talked about EHS today. I think I would summarize it right as number one, when you're thinking about this, you got to play the long game, right? You got to think about this is not going to be something you're going to put in place on Monday, and Tuesday you're going to have a huge
Yeah.
reduction in
It's a strategy,
LCEs in
not
your
a,
plant,
a
right?
tool. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you got to kind of play that long game. You got to be prepared to listen, but you got to be able to tell these stories to your stakeholders. You got to be able to talk to them about the impacts, plural, that
Mhm.
it's having on operations, safety, health and wellness of your employees, the uptime of your equipment, perhaps your financials. So you're going to have to be able to talk, right? You're going to have to get out, take your pocket protector out, and go actually talk to some stakeholders, right? So play that long game, have those conversations. And I think one of the things that you keep saying, Dane, that I think is brilliant, which right, is you got to be able to monitor and track this over time. You got to have this stuff tied into the LMS. You got to be able to look at that data over time and see what's happening, what metrics are being impacted, um, and be prepared to shift and adjust, right? And what we get from XR is we get a whole lot more there than we get from someone scribbling yeah, they passed on a clipboard, right? We get better
Absolutely.
metrics.
Well, the other thing, so the last conversation that we had, we talked about setting the baseline, right? That was like that we talked about that quite a bit in our first episode. Is a lot of times you go in here
Mhm.
and it's hard to know what the baseline is that you're measuring against. The
Yeah.
nice thing about EHS is that we have a lot of those metrics because we have to report on them,
Yeah.
right? And so it gives you a baseline that you can work from. And so I think EHS is a great place to start, for anybody who's looking to get started, because
Right.
one, the content's already built out, you can go buy it from the market. Two, like, your metrics are already in place. And three, it gets it on the heads and a lot of people introduced to it. And so yeah, I think it's a great place to start.
Right.
Sure.
But we'd love to hear what everyone else has to say about this. If you got comments, drop them in. Let us know how you're using XR to have a positive impact on the health and wellness and safety of your industrial workers, right? Or maybe even knowledge workers. I don't know. I mean, the ergonomic stuff going on with my chair or something, but it's not just in the factory. There's a lot of ways to look at this. And so give us your comments. Dan and I would appreciate it. I think it's a good topic. And we'll be back next week talking about some of those enterprise use cases, things that don't maybe fit into factory production, health and safety. We're going to talk about some other topics next week and round out this 3-part series. Dan, great job today, man. I really appreciate it.
You too, Scott. Thanks, man.
Hey, stay safe, buddy.
Yeah, you too.
All right. See ya.
See ya.